รายการต่อไปนี้เป็นรายการทั่วไปสามารถรับชมได้ทุกวัย
สนับสนุนโดยแลกเงินด้วยบัตรเครดิตกสิกรไทยเที่ยวก่อนจ่ายทีหลังไม่มีค่าธรรมเนียมผ่อนชำระได้จากธนาคารกสิกรไทย
สวัสดีค่ะ Renew Newcastle เป็นโครงการฟื้นฟูเมืองที่ประสบความสำเร็จอย่างมากในประเทศออสเตรเลียเป็นโครงการที่ทำให้ย่านใจกลางเมืองนิวคาสเซิลซึ่งเคยมีตึกรกร้างเป็นจำนวนมากกลับมามีชีวิตอีกครั้งโดยทำให้พื้นที่ว่างเปล่าเหล่านั้นกลายเป็นพื้นที่สร้างสรรค์เช่นเปิดเป็นแกลเลอรี่แสดงผลงานศิลปะเปิดเป็นร้านกาแฟหรือเปิดเป็นร้านขายของงานฝีมือเป็นต้นอะไรคือแนวคิดและวิธีการทำงานของ Renew Newcastle และโครงการแบบนี้จะช่วยสร้างศักยภาพกระตุ้นเศรษฐกิจให้กับเมืองได้อย่างไรเราจะคุยกับคุณมาคัส เวสเบอรีผู้ก่อตั้งโครงการ Renew Newcastle ค่ะเมืองนิวคาสเซิลรัฐนิวเซาท์เวลส์ประเทศออสเตรเลียเคยรุ่งเรืองเป็นศูนย์กลางอุตสาหกรรมเหล็กและถ่านหินแต่เมื่อเกือบ10 ปีที่ผ่านมาประสบปัญหาเศรษฐกิจทำให้ย่านกลางเมืองมีอาคารรกร้างไร้ผู้เช่ากว่า150แห่งจนในปี 2008 มาคัส เวสเบอรีนักเขียนผู้ประกาศข่าวและผู้เชี่ยวชาญด้านสื่อซึ่งวัยเด็กเติบโตที่นิวคาสเซิลได้คิดช่วยบ้านเกิดของเขาด้วยการริเริ่มโครงการ Renew Newcastle โดยเชื่อมโยงตึกร้างที่ถูกทิ้งไว้เปล่าประโยชน์กับคนที่มีความคิดสร้างสรรค์แต่ไม่มีพื้นที่แสดงออกเข้าด้วยกันโดยเจ้าของตึกได้อนุญาตให้คนที่มีไอเดียดีๆมาใช้ประโยชน์จากพื้นที่ที่ยังไม่มีคนเช่าได้ชั่วคราวอย่างเช่นเปิดเป็นร้านงานฝีมือเก๋ๆร้านกาแฟเท่ๆรวมถึงเปิดแกลเลอรี่แสดงผลงานศิลปะเป็นต้นจนทำให้นิวคาสเซิลเป็นเมืองที่มีความน่าสนใจคึกคักและเป็นจุดหมายปลายทางใหม่ของนักเดินทางทั่วโลกปัจจุบันนอกจาก Renew Newcastle ยังมี Renew Australia ซึ่งได้ทำโครงการชุมชนสร้างสรรค์ไปแล้วกว่า200โครงการในพื้นที่ที่ถูกทิ้งร้างทั่วออสเตรเลีย What's the situation in Newcastle like that make you think you have to renew the city?
It was an old industrial city. I mean, it had been once it had been the home of the Australian steel industry. 20,000 jobs in the steel, making steel there. And then in the sort of 70s to the 90s, all that started to close down. A lot of the other big industry started to close down, and so it left a big hole in the city. Thousands and thousands of jobs had left. There was 40% youth unemployment there when I was a kid. And then the most visible thing, there was 150 empty buildings in the two main streets. And it just broke my heart. I mean, I would go home to my hometown and just walk up and down these streets that as a kid I remember playing in and meeting friends on that corner and all of those things that you do. And it was becoming emptier and emptier.
How did you come up with the idea Renew Newcastle?
A couple of different things. I mean, partially I visited a few other places where I'd seen them use empty buildings better than we do in Australia. But it was very practical. It was partially I actually had an idea myself. I was going to start a small little bar, and I found that even though there was all these empty buildings, it was actually very hard to rent any of them. Because in a lot of cases they were just owned by investors who were sitting on them for a long time. There were just a lot of reasons. It was complicated. It was very hard to do things. And because the rents had fallen so low and the buildings were falling apart, it was just too much trouble. I think everyone was waiting for some big thing to come in from outside. Someone to come in and spend $500 million and build a whole new something to replace it all. And to me that's just, that's not the scale I work at. So my thoughts were, how about we get all those people that have got little ideas, rather than one big idea, just lots of little ideas, and set up a system to get those people into those spaces and give them a chance to do things in them. And that's where Renew began.
So once you have the Renew Newcastle idea,
Yeah.
how did you go about working on it?
We go to a property owner who has an empty building and we say, while it's empty, can you lend it to us for 30 days at a time? We will lend it to someone who has an idea for a project that they want to start, and we will sit in the middle of those two things, and we will guarantee that they'll take care of it and that it's properly insured, and that when it's time for them to leave, that they'll leave. So a lot of the work in the early days was about getting all of that framework right, all the systems right to manage that, then going to the owners and saying, can we have the properties?
How did you get the building owners to agree with you?
We were lucky. Partially, but some of it was timing. So Renew began in 2008, and I guess it was, although Newcastle had been on a bit of a slide for a long time, it was around the same time as the financial crisis, and so I think a lot of owners suddenly realised that whatever they thought they were doing wasn't going to happen quickly. There was one particular property owner, a company called the GPT Group. They owned a lot of land in the centre of the city which they intended to redevelop, but then, you know, the financial crisis being what it was meant that they knew they weren't going to do it soon. So they were the first to sign up, and because they had quite a few properties, they gave us a nice critical mass to begin with. And then it's just been a slow process. It's, we're talking to everyone from publicly listed companies, with billion-dollar valuations to mum and dad investors who bought a little apartment, shop as something for their retirement, and everyone in between. And so there's a lot of different people with different reasons for owning property. A lot of the conversations we have with owners are about seeing the bigger picture, about growing foot traffic, growing value, growing the area by bringing people back to it. Then they benefit. The moment the area becomes busy and lively and active again, they're suddenly in a much better position to rent their property or sell their property or redevelop or whatever it is they want to do than they would be if they just let it sit empty for 5 years.
นับเป็นแนวคิดที่น่าสนใจมากในการเปิดโอกาสให้คนที่มีไอเดียดีๆได้มีพื้นที่ในการเริ่มต้นความฝันในการทำโครงการหรือกิจการของตัวเองในขณะที่เจ้าของตึกก็ได้ร้านรวงเหล่านี้มาสร้างความคึกคักและความมีชีวิตชีวาทำให้ตึกที่เคยรกร้างกลายเป็นพื้นที่ที่มีมูลค่ามากขึ้นเรียกได้ว่าสมประโยชน์ทั้งสองฝ่ายช่วงหน้าไปคุยถึงกระบวนการทำงานของ Renew Newcastle กันต่อค่ะในการมาร่วมโครงการ Renew Newcastle ผู้สนใจต้องส่งรายละเอียดโครงการที่อยากทำมาเสนอโดยต้องเป็นโครงการที่มีความคิดสร้างสรรค์และไม่ซ้ำกับผู้ที่มีอยู่เดิมในขณะที่ทางทีมงานของ Renew Newcastle จะเลือกพื้นที่ที่เหมาะสมกับลักษณะโครงการเพื่อให้ผู้สมัครได้มาใช้พื้นที่เป็นระยะเวลาสั้นๆในการทดลองเริ่มต้นกิจการ How do you invite project owners to join you?
So we use social media a lot. We use Facebook. We use the local press. There's stories. We get stories in the local Newcastle newspapers and radio when there's opportunities to come up. But we've never had any difficulty finding projects. We've obviously got our own email lists, and for every project we've done, there's probably 5 or maybe 10 that we haven't done because we didn't have a space, or there's always a longer waiting list than there is spaces available, even in a city with that many vacant spaces.
How do you select projects?
It starts with a very practical question, which is we've got a space, and if the space to some extent defines what you can do with it. We do what's easy. We don't try and hold out for what's perfect. We do what's easy. And so if you've got a small little narrow shop front and you've got a jeweller who makes things that are really small, that's probably a good fit for a space like that. You've got a huge, vast, space that used to be a supermarket or something, then you'd use it for something like a photography gallery or something where the openness of the space, or a sculpture gallery, so where the openness of the space is an asset. And so it's about, sometimes it's as simple as that. The owners always are involved in choosing what goes in their properties. We can never force an owner to take a project, so they have to be comfortable with what it is. And then we look for other things, like we look for a mix of things. We don't want everything to be the same. We want things to, ideally you want things that kind of, someone might come because they're very passionate about one thing and then be curious about the things that are around it. So there's this sense of cross discovery, and there's also other things we need. We need you to be good at what you do. Like if you make jewellery, you need to show us you can make jewellery, and if you make clothes, you need to show us you can make clothes. And then there's also other things, like where a shop is or where a space is will determine what hours make sense for it to be open. So if you're going to have a shop that's right on the main corner in town, we want it to be open all the time, and during all business hours. If it's a space that's sort of downstairs and round the back or an office that's upstairs somewhere, it doesn't matter so much. So again, some of it's matching the uses to the spaces.
Why focus on creative enterprises?
There's a few reasons. Part of it is because that's my world. I was an arts festival director. I came from that background. There's a few things we're trying to do, and there's a few things we need to be very aware of. So one is we're trying to make a place that is distinctive and original. We don't want to, we could probably fill the shop, I don't know whether you could, you'd probably fill the shops with shops selling plastic junk trinkets, and they may or may not sell and they may or may not work, but it will be like every other place anywhere. It makes no difference. One of our key rules from the beginning was you can't directly compete with an existing business in the city. So we set it on the rule that you need to make what you do. Whatever you do, it has to be an original thing and you have to make it. And that could be design, or it could be computer programming, it could be fashion, it could be visual art, it could be sculpture, it could be photography. But what it inherently meant is that every single one of those spaces had something you couldn't find anywhere else. And so suddenly there was a reason to visit, rather than being like all the other shopping centres that have all, go to the shopping centres in Bangkok and I see a lot of the same brands and a lot of the same stuff I see in the shopping centres in Newcastle.
ผู้ที่มาเช่าพื้นที่ของตึกไม่ต้องเสียค่าเช่าเลยจะมีเพียงค่าใช้จ่ายเล็กน้อยสำหรับการดูแลซ่อมบำรุงสถานที่โดยจะมีระยะเวลาการเช่าระยะสั้นประมาณ30วันระหว่างนั้นหากมีผู้มาเช่าพื้นที่นั้นผู้ประกอบการต้องย้ายออกแต่หากกิจการไปได้ดีและยังไม่มีผู้มาเช่าผู้ประกอบกิจการสามารถตกลงทำสัญญากับเจ้าของตึกเพื่อเช่าต่อได้
So all of these project owners, they do have to pay rent to you?
No,
No.
They don't pay rent. So no one pays rent. So we borrow the properties. We take care of the costs, so they pay for if they use gas or water or electricity, or they pay for all of those things. They pay a little bit of money that goes into a fund to cover insurance. The properties are all insured under a scheme while we have them there, and we also have money. We take a little bit of money for minor maintenance. So if the glass breaks in the window, we'll put the glass back in. Or if it's amazing how often you'll need a locksmith because someone breaks a lock, or just really basic little things like that we do along the way. We don't take rent. But what we ask them to do is improve the value of the property by being there. So often they will make it look better, they will clean it up, they will often paint it. But we agree on all these things with the property owners. But essentially, their job is to make the street and the city interesting. And that's their contribution. And they're doing it at a time when what would be the default would be that it would be falling apart. And so if they want security, if they want to stay there for, if their business is successful, usually they will start to negotiate and pay rent.
What do building owners get?
They get They get a space that's better presented. they get foot traffic. I mean, that's the really big thing. I mean, if you see before and after photos, I mean, you've got these blocks where there's 5 or 6 empty shops in a row, and there's no one there. There's no one coming there. No one wants to open it. No one wants to be the first person to open a business on an empty block. And indeed, if half the block is empty, the other half will leave. So what we're doing is putting down all these things that are attractors. They're you can spend a lot of money on marketing. You can spend a lot of money paying performers to dance out the front of these places and try and get people to come and watch the performances. This doesn't cost anything, but it brings people. And so when you bring people, bringing people brings the confidence of other businesses to come and invest. So when you start to see the shops are full and there's people visiting and there's curiosity and there's good stories in the newspaper, then someone who has an idea to start a cafe or a bar or a restaurant will come and open up on that street, and then the properties will start to rent, and then the process, the loop becomes a positive loop rather than a negative loop.
โครงการ Renew Newcastle เป็นโครงการไม่แสวงหาผลกำไร ปัจจุบันได้รับเงินสนับสนุนส่วนหนึ่งจากรัฐบาลท้องถิ่น เนื่องจากเป็นโครงการที่ไม่เพียงช่วยฟื้นฟูสภาพเศรษฐกิจโดยรวมของเมือง แต่ยังช่วยลดสถิติการเกิดอาชญากรรมในเมืองได้ถึง25%อีกด้วย ไม่ว่าจะเป็นการทำลายข้าวของ การบุกรุกอาคารอย่างผิดกฎหมาย และการเข้าขโมยทรัพย์สินต่างๆในอาคารเป็นต้น
Where does Renew Newcastle get funding from?
So when it first started, I seed funded it on my credit card. I just paid to do it. After about a year or so, the city, the government in Newcastle and the state government in the state of New South Wales, where Newcastle is, both started to put a little bit of money into it through partially through as an economic development initiative for the city. So we get enough funding from the government to cover about 2 staff. So that allows us to do marketing, it allows us to do minor works on properties, so when a property needs to have a little bit of rewiring done or glass put in windows or whatever to reopen them. We have a bit of a budget now to do that. It allows us to do promotion, it allows us to just keep the scheme ticking over. But it's not a for-profit venture.
What's the result financially overall?
Well, it depends on how you measure it. We've started or helped grow 60 or 70 businesses that are still running. We have reopened 80 properties that were empty. So I don't know how much value you put on 80 formerly empty buildings being reopened. There's about 30 or 40 of our projects that have signed commercial leases, so they're commercial businesses. We've had a couple that have gone on. One of our projects was a media company gone on to. They employ 10 or 20 people now. One of their biggest shareholders is a television network owned by Rupert Murdoch. So, they've grown from a start-up little online business that was being run from someone's bedroom to now being a small but successful national and international media companies. There's now 500,000 people a year more coming to Newcastle for tourism than there was when we started this 6 or 7 years ago. And a lot of the tourism stories, it's hard, almost no one writes a tourism story about Newcastle without mentioning Renew. So. Newcastle has actually changed its fortunes not by someone throwing hundreds of millions of dollars at fixing it, but because hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people have gone building by building, shop by shop, space by space. They've rolled their sleeves up, they've got dirty, they've got the paintbrushes out, they've cleaned up these spaces, they've made their city look and feel loved and cared for again through doing these projects. And I think there's a great deal of pride from all of those people that they've played, just through doing their own projects, they've all played a role in that process.
Can this model be replicated anywhere in any cities?
I don't think it can be replicated anywhere. I don't think it's as simple as that. But I think some of the ideas and some of the thinking behind it can. So the first one is this idea that, look, vacant space, it's a lost opportunity. Every day a shop is empty or an office is empty, you're wasting the chance to start a new business or start a new community project. Because there's a lot of businesses and a lot of projects out there that just need a little bit of space. So it's very low cost to do it that way. I think there's value in, and I think this is a challenge, and it's a challenge for Bangkok, it's a challenge for a lot of cities I visit. Increasingly, all the cities of the world start to feel a bit all like all the other cities in the world. You know, they've all got the same shopping malls. They've all got the same whatever. You know, there's some differences. You know, obviously there's differences, but I think one of the great lessons from this is that you can actually look inward to the talent and the imagination of the people that are in your own community to create a sense of place that is different to what you can get in other communities.
เมื่อไม่นานมานี้คุณมาคัส เวสเบอรี่เดินทางมาเมืองไทยเพื่อเข้าร่วมงานเสวนา Creating Cities Co-Create เจริญกรุงด้วยกรุงเทพมหานครเองก็มีโครงการสร้างสรรค์เจริญกรุงซึ่งมีเป้าหมายในการพัฒนาพื้นที่ย่านเจริญกรุงที่เคยเป็นย่านสำคัญทางเศรษฐกิจและสังคมในอดีตแต่ปัจจุบัน123%ของที่ดินและอาคารในเขตบางรักถูกปล่อยทิ้งร้างให้กลับฟื้นคืนเป็นพื้นที่สร้างสรรค์ของกรุงเทพอีกครั้ง
For Cherun Krung area in Bangkok, do you see the potential to become more or less like Newcastle?
I think there is a great potential here to have a district full of distinctive, original, contemporary cultural things that are from and of Bangkok, you know? And I think that's hard to find. As an outsider, that's hard to find because if you end up in one of the touristy zones, you're getting sold a lot of junk that's not very interesting. Or if you end up in the shopping centres, you're seeing the same stuff you see at the airport or you see at home. So I think if you can foster, there is a huge potential here, and you start to see seeds of it with the jam factory. You see seeds of it for galleries, for artisans. If you bring enough of those people together, that in and of itself becomes a reason to be here and visit here and be part of it. And I see the seeds, and I think you could probably plant a few more, but I think it's got a lot of potential.
การฟื้นฟูเมืองด้วยพื้นที่สร้างสรรค์ของโครงการ Renew Newcastle ไม่ได้ใช้เงินลงทุนเป็นจำนวนมากและไม่ได้ใช้เทคโนโลยีซับซ้อนแต่อย่างใดแต่เป็นการคิดนอกกรอบในการนำเอาทรัพยากรที่มีอยู่มาใช้ให้เกิดประโยชน์สูงสุดนั่นก็คือจับคู่กันระหว่างพื้นที่หรือว่าตึกรกร้างว่างเปล่ากับคนที่มีความคิดสร้างสรรค์และมาช่วยทำให้พื้นที่ว่างเปล่านั้นมีมูลค่าเพิ่มมากขึ้นและนี่ก็คืออีกหนึ่งโครงการที่น่าสนใจในการฟื้นฟูเมืองทำให้กลับมามีชีวิตชีวาอีกครั้งหนึ่งค่ะพบกันใหม่สัปดาห์หน้าวันนี้สวัสดีค่ะ